So warm welcome to those of you who are here just now, live on the Zoom. And for those of you watching this later on YouTube, then good morning or good afternoon or good evening, wherever you are. And welcome to this one-off talk. I don't know why, but it just came into my head to set it up a couple of weeks ago. And here we are. It's a bit improvised, but I hope it will be useful and, how can you say, an appropriate and wonderful. Okay now? No, good. So yeah, I hope it will be an appropriate and a wonderful thing for us to do together today. Today is a special day in the Buddhist calendar, in the Tibetan Buddhist calendar, in all Buddhist calendars, but in Tibet it's one of the four major times, spiritual times of the year. And so what are those times? There is the whole fortnight at Tibetan New Year, and that's when we celebrate the Buddha's miracles. And then there is the turning of the wheel of Dharma, Buddha's teaching. And then there is the Vesak, or Sakadawa. That's when we celebrate both the Buddha's birth and the Buddha's enlightenment. It's the fourth lunar month. And on the 15th day, we celebrate that. And then there is this today. If we use the Tibetan term, it's called LhaBap DuChen. DuChen means major festival. LhaBap, La means devas, gods, Bap means coming down, descent from the deva realm. And maybe you've seen one of these famous tonkas where there's like a jeweled staircase and the Buddha is descending very, very nobly down this jeweled staircase, surrounded by gods, goddesses, arhats, and all sorts of beings. So anyway, that's what we're celebrating today. What the Tibetans say is, and there are other festivals, of course, there's commemorating events in the Buddha's life, but they're the four big ones. And on those times, Tibetans say that things are multiplied. So all of our good thoughts, good deeds, good words, they have a lot more power. The numbers vary, but it's sort of thousands, hundreds of thousands, millions of times. But of course, also the same for the harmful things. If we do a little bit of harm, then it becomes amplified many, many times. So quite how that works is impossible to explain. Whether it's arbitrary and it becomes a more powerful day because we've all decided, and generations of teachers have decided that it should be that way, so it makes it that way, or whether there is something in the fiber of time and space which makes for these special occasions. So anyway, it's a special day. On special days, we need to do good things. These special days are interesting because when people first come across Buddhism, they think, oh, these are auspicious days, like, every new moon, full moon, we try to do a few more prayers, a bit more practice. But it's not because they're auspicious days, it's the opposite. It's because they're supposed to be difficult days, difficult energy days. And certainly that's, I think it's an established fact. New moon and full moon. In yogic terms, our energies are up in the top of the head, makes people disturbed, easier to get angry, easy to get upset, and you can feel more unbalanced. So in those times, it's very important that we practice to counterbalance and to turn something difficult into something useful. And I think that's probably the case for lots of things. Anyway, today is LhaBap, Buddha's return to earth from the Deva realms. So I need to say just a few words about that before we go to Gampopa's story. Buddha was born in a human body, and he had a mother, Mahamaya. And so it says in past lives, at one point, she'd made a very deep promise or prayer that in the future, because she was connected with the Bodhisattva who was to become the Buddha, she made a deep prayer that when the time came for his manifestation of enlightenment here on earth, that she would be the one to carry him. And then sometimes when lamas explain this, they say it needs a very special person to carry a Buddha in the womb and give birth to the Buddha. And so that was Mahamaya. She made that promise. So it's an interesting story. We don't have time. I don't have the knowledge either. But she made the promise to bear the Buddha and to put him into this world, but not to be his mother who brought him up. So 7 days after his birth, she died. Because of her excellent karma, she was reborn in one of the, I was going to say very nice, as though I know them, like hotels, but one of the very nice Deva realms, which is called Tushita. And so she was there as the Buddha grew up. And the Buddha was brought up by his foster mother, who was a relative, and she later on became a nun and very important in the female earliest Sangha. So anyway, at one point in the Buddha's life, when his own Sangha was established, then he spent 3 months visiting a Deva realm. Now what happened, it's like a meeting. His mother, it says, came down from Tushita, Deva realm, God realm, to the one that's known as the 33, number 33. There are lots of explanations why it's called that. 33 special features, 33 special gods, whatever. But she came down to there, and the Buddha went up to there to teach the gods of the 33 heaven, and at the same time to liberate his mother's mind out of gratitude and profound connection between them. And so that's what he did. The whole history of Abhidharma is a bit complicated. It's not today's topic. There's a bit of a conflict between what the historians say and the research says, and then what the party line, Mahayana, and then Tibetan Buddhist version says. Doesn't matter. We've got Abhidharma and it's wonderful. But Abhidharma is all the details of Buddhist philosophy about mind and matter, all of it. It's incredibly vast and complicated. If you know something of Theravada Buddhism, you'll have seen how complicated it can get. So it's said the Buddha taught it in the Deva realms to those gods, because to really get it, you need to hear the whole thing in one session. Which for us humans is not possible. We need to sleep, eat, have a break, and it takes months and months and months, at least. In the Shedras, it takes years to master it. But in the Deva realms, one of their days is said to be like hundreds of our years. Anyway, that's the party lines. The Buddha went there, taught the Devas the Abhidharma, And then, depending on the version, when he'd finished and returned to earth, then he taught it to his main disciples, Shariputra and Ananda. Ananda, his main attendant, his nephew, had a deal with the Buddha, as the Karmapa explained at length in his talks this year, that if he was going to be Buddha's attendant, then the Buddha had to include him in every teaching. And if he missed one because he was away somewhere, then the Buddha had to repeat the teaching so that he hadn't missed anything. And Ananda, later on, in the first council, was the reference because he'd heard all the teachings since the time he became Buddha's attendant. So some versions say after the Buddha descended from Tushita, then he gave the Abhidharma teachings to his Sangha. Some versions say that every evening he came back down and shared a batch of teachings. Anyway, this is what we are celebrating. It's Buddha liberating his mother and then returning to our world. So it's good to do something virtuous today, and we're going to peek into the life of our wonderful Dharma ancestor, Gampopa. Gampopa is absolutely vital to our lineage. Without Gampopa, we may not have had a lineage at all. And then everything that's in our lineage, not everything, but most of it, is very much thanks to Gampopa. In my own life, I feel I have a very wonderful connection with Gampopa, mainly through His Holiness 16th Karmapa, because in 1977, I had the good fortune with Katia to be asked to join His Holiness Karmapa for his 6-month tour of Europe. And there weren't many Dharma centers at the time, but there were groups of Dharma people in many countries. And so the 16th Karmapa spent 6 months. And before he came, we got together a bus we could all travel in, and so on and so on. Very nice. We stripped out half the inside of the bus, put in 2 huge swivel armchairs for the Karmapa and Jamgon Kongtrul Rinpoche, some cupboards where he could keep his birds and bits and pieces. So one side of the bus was the VIP side, and the other side of the bus was the 12, 15 people traveling with him. And then Akon Rinpoche, myself, Katia, the bus drivers, a couple of European Rinpoches. And we traveled all around Europe for 6 months. Until that time, in my own life, then my teacher, Akon Rinpoche, had very much kept me away from study and insisted on meditation practice. So for about 7 years, I've been doing quite intense meditation. And he made it very clear that that wasn't the time to learn Tibetan language. But now we were going to be 6 months in a bus traveling with lots of Tibetans. So Katia and I asked, can't we just exchange a bit of Tibetan for a bit of English with the monks? And Akon Rinpoche said, and it surprised us, he didn't say, yeah, I'll fix it up, or maybe not. He said, I'll ask His Holiness. So he comes back the next day and he says, yes, you'll learn some Tibetan, but not colloquial Tibetan. You'll learn Dharma Tibetan. And Khenpo Sultim Gyatso had just arrived to join the tour as the philosophy teacher. He said, so the Karmapa had said, you'll learn Dharma with Khenpo Sultim Gyatso, and you'll learn Gampopa's ornament of precious liberation. And so the very next day we started, had class, had to learn things by heart and so on. And as we traveled around in the 6 months, then what was at the beginning myself and Katia other people wanted to sit in, and it became a traveling school. And we had a little group of people. And then after that, because that was so successful, and I mean, I don't want to deviate, but it's a nice story. Maybe you've seen lately His Holiness's official translator, 16th Karmapa, Achitsepa, he started putting stuff online, his memories of the 16th Karmapa. It's very nice. He's a wonderful guy. So he was the Karmapa's interpreter, but he himself knew barely any Dharma. He'd been educated very nicely in a Christian school in Darjeeling. So he was very well-mannered, excellent interpreter for the 16th Karmapa when he met diplomats, heads of state, heads of church, and so on, which he did all over. So Achi was wonderful, but he didn't have a clue about Dharma. Really didn't. So the Karmapa was nearly all the time giving ceremonies, empowerments, refuge, and not Dharma talks. He only gave 2, 3, 4, 5 Dharma talks all the way around. But at one point, about halfway through the tour, then he could see Achi wasn't getting it. He was trying to convey something. So he called up at that time Katia, because he knew already through 3 months with Khenpo Sotim, there'd been a lot of learning. So anyway, after the 6 months, it had gone so well. Then the Karmapa told Khenpo Sotim to stay in Europe, and then for another 6 months to make a translator's school where the people who'd shown interest when we traveled around could learn Tibetan. So we were the interpreters for Khenpo for the school. So anyway, in that 1 year, and then afterwards with Khenpo Sotim, the Karmapa's instruction was to learn and translate Gampopa's Ornament of Precious Liberation and some other texts, like Maitreya's Buddha Nature text. Afterwards, in Samiling, then I spent a lot of time, some years, producing a first translation that Samiling published. And then many years later, the Sadra Foundation approached me because when they ask who's the Gampopa expert in the Kaju, then people pointed them in my direction for some reason. So they asked me to do a new translation, which I did with Geshe Thupten Jinpa, who many of you know as His Holiness Dalai Lama's interpreter. So anyway, that means a lot of years, a lot of publication work. And as we'll see at the end of this talk, Gampopa says anyone who has a devoted connection with that text, it will be the same for them as if I was right there in front of them. And I must say, I don't know how to say it without saying it naturally. All the time I was sitting in front of my computer, one of the very first huge computers, primitive computers, working with the old floppy disks, which are about this big, really black floppy things. Yeah, it's like he was there. I can't put it any other way. And it made it so easy to work with. It's like I had a translation buddy right there in front of me for all the months, all the sessions I worked in it. So that connection for me is incomparable. And I just hope that through talking about Gampopa's life, it makes a bit of a connection with you, because as we'll see in our Kamakaju lineage, connection is more important than anything. Connection with devotion. So, I better start on the actual life. So, Gampopa's life, right? Where's the information? Well, the information that's published in English, there are a few books now, but mainly is based on the life of Gampopa inside the 100,000 songs of Milarepa. It's a huge chapter. It's really fascinating. And we'll come to that later because it's one of the few places you get insight into the meditation experiences of somebody like Gampopa. So it's fascinating. But the 100,000 songs of Milarepa and his life story, that life story of Milarepa. And so within that, Gampopa's story was written by Tsangmyon Heruka about 300 years after Milarepa and Gampopa. And so once you look into the Tibetan a bit, you can see he's a good writer. He's very eloquent, beautiful writer, and he'd gathered together the oral traditions of the story of Milarepa mainly, but within that, the story of Gampopa. Now, oral traditions are told. If any of you have met storytellers and you know storytelling, well, it's storytelling. You like the juicy bits, the anecdotes, and then you can always make a story a little bit more, so that at some points it brings the tears, and at other points you feel very, very happy. So it's quite a dramatic account, let's say, of Milarepa's life and Gampopa's life. And many, many lamas use that. They take it as like gospel. That's how it was. What's interesting is our current Karmapa has realized history, I think. What happens to people, what happens to religions, what happens to texts as the centuries go by. And he's doing a lot of research. And so he gave a much better talk than I'm giving today about the life of Gampopa a few months ago. You'll find it on YouTube. It's wonderful. But please, when you get the time, check it out. But there, he preferred to use Gampopa's life story written by the first Karmapa. Now, the first Karmapa was Gampopa's disciple. So he knew him. And it seems obvious that the life story given by somebody who was there and who knew a person is probably more reliable than a life story written 3 centuries later, mainly based on oral tradition, but within the story, it said that Tsangmyon Heruka was one of the reincarnations of Rinpoche, Milarepa's disciple, so that makes it a bit more complicated. Anyway, trying to put all that together, what we need to do is sort out the sheep from the goats and say what's really important for us about Gampopa. And the juicy bits of the stories, they're nice. I hope there'll be time for some of them today. But there's some things which are much, much more important to the whole Kagyu school and tradition and to us at present. So I'll try to highlight those. The story, we have to start back with the Buddha if we're thinking of Gampopa. And at one point, the Buddha gave a teaching. It was called the Samadhi Raja Sutra. Samadhi means meditation, absorption. Raja is king, that's like Raja in India. And Sutra, discourse. The discourse that's the king of meditation. Now this was towards the end of the Buddha's life. He taught a lot of meditation to the various people. And this was Buddha showing, not teaching with words although of course there are words recorded in the sutra, but it was what we would call these days a pointing out. Buddha sharing where all of the paths of meditation end up. In Europe, there's a saying from the Roman times, all roads lead to Rome. And of course, they were just incredible road builders, and the rest were just dirt tracks, if anything. But the real roads that you could take vehicles, people, armies along, they all spread out from Rome. So all the Buddhist paths, according to our tradition, end up one way or another in recognition of Buddha nature. There are many absorptions. There are many meditations when you look through the Mahayana Sutras, Sutra of Golden Light, Avatamsaka, and all of those. You see these pure lands, which are meditation states. Amazing, unbelievable. But it all ends up with a recognition or a being in the endless, timeless, enlightened, pure, perfect nature of mind that we call Mahamudra or Dzogchen. So the Buddha pointed to his main disciples. He showed them this is what it's all about. It's all to get you here. There is nothing other than this. This includes everything. So that teaching was called Samadhi Raja Sutra, and it's a vital teaching, because if you lose the essential point, it's all to get you here, then you've got lots of paths and so many spiritual experiences, meditation experiences. But they can't come to an end. You're stuck somewhere along the journey. There's not the final destination. So Buddha said in the future, in what he called the Dharma declining, the Dharma ending age, who will keep this teaching alive? And there was one of the bodhisattvas who was there, whose name was Chandra Prabha Kumara. It means beautiful youth of moonlight, or beautiful moon-like youth, youthful, all those ideas are in there, right? And it's one of those things, I don't know if you can imagine Buddha sitting silently, probably, with all these disciples, and they're the mature meditators. They're all in together, Buddha mind, through the Buddha's blessing. And then he says, who will preserve this in the future age? So without a word, they all find themselves looking at Chandra Prabha Kumara. It's his destiny. And he promises us to be able to do that. And many of the other bodhisattvas, they say, we'll help you. We'll manifest at that time. We'll help you. And so we see Gampopa as being the reincarnation or the manifestation of Chandra Prabha Kumara. And then our great Kagyu Lamas, like the Karmapas and the Tsitupas and the Shamapas, as being the bodhisattvas, like Maitreya, Manjushri, and so on, who promised to help him to keep that quintessential insight alive. So then he manifested later in Tibet, and in another sutra given by Lord Buddha Shakyamuni, called the White Lotus Great Compassion Sutra. There he predicts that in a future age, in the north, someone will be born, and that person will be a doctor, a physician, and they will bring a great benefit to the Dharma in a place by a red river. Rivers usually take the color of the stones that are in their banks, in their bed. And where Gampopa manifested most of his activity, a place called Gampo, that's why he's called Gampopa. So Gampo, just makes the substantive, the person from Gampo, was next to a river which had red rock in its bed. So we Tibetans see that as a prediction of Gampopa. He was born in southern Tibet in a place, well, depends which biography you go to. Generally, he's known as the person from two places, actually. He's Gampopa because of Gampo area where he taught, he had his activity. He's also known as Dakpo Rinpoche because he grew up in the Dakpo area. Dakpo is in southern Tibet. And so some biographies say he was born in central Tibet in a place called Nyal, and that his parents moved quite soon to southern Tibet, to Dakpo, but that's where he grew up. His father was an excellent doctor and also a Nyingmapa practicer, meditator. And so Gampopa grew up learning his father's trade. He became a very good doctor. In his teens, he received quite a lot of Dharma teachings already. He was very committed to Dharma. He received both Nyingmapa empowerments and teachings, and also some Kadampa teachings from Atisha's tradition. And then he eventually came to an age where he married. So he was a somebody. In Tibetan villages, the doctors, usually the big shot, right? They're the most important person. So his father was a very important person. He grew up to be a doctor. He married an important lady from the next village. And so she was called Chogme, and he married her when he was 22. And they had 2 children, a boy and a girl. Although some biographies seem to say more like 1 child, it doesn't matter. They were married, they had children, he was practicing as a doctor, and then some kind of bug, virus, plague hit the area. And so first of all, one of Gampopa's children died, caught the disease that was going around, died very quickly. And Gampopa took him, had him buried with all the ceremonies of, however they did it, sky burial, probably. When he came back home, he found the other child had died as well. So he buried the second child. And then he found his wife had caught it. And the others, they'd all gone down very quickly, a very virulent sort of fever, plague that just took people out very quickly. But his wife, Chombe, wouldn't die. She was in agony, suffering so much. He was a doctor. He could see, you ought to die, but you're not dying. So he said, what is it? There's something, there must be something in this world, some possession, something you're clinging to so much that you have this iron will to live, which is resisting, even though your whole body is in serious decline, pain, agony. And so she said, yeah, she could obviously still talk. There is something. It's you. She said, I cannot bear the thought of your beautiful presence, because he was obviously a wonderful presence. It says later on we learn he'd been a 10th level bodhisattva, helping many, many, many hundreds of Buddhas in the past. An ancient, pure bodhisattva mind. So it was obviously an ideal husband, let's say, a dream husband. She said, I can't bear the thought of you marrying again, having another wife, somebody else having what I can't have anymore. So he said, he knew she had to die because her body just couldn't hold. And he knew that for her mind's peace, she needed to die in peace, peacefully. So he said, if it helps, I promise you that if you die, then I'll never take another wife. I'll become a monastic. I'll follow the Dharma. She was pretty insistent. She said, yes, but I want you to make that promise in front of a witness. So she called her uncle to come, or they called her uncle to come. And so Gampopa made this solemn promise that he would give up worldly life, become a monk, and in front of the uncle. And then she was very relieved, and she could die, and she could die peacefully, which she did. And he buried her. And then he made this promise to transition from being a well-off, respected person in the community, a doctor, to becoming a monastic. So he turned all of his wealth into two parts. One part he used to honor his wife and children and make offerings for them, make offerings, do things good locally. The other half he kept to support him through his Dharma journey. And he went and he became a monk. He became a monk locally, fairly locally, and where he went to, first of all, receive ordination and then receive teachings was in a monastery of the Kadampa tradition. So without getting too lost in the history, the Kagyu lineage hadn't started yet. There weren't Kagyu monasteries. Gampopa later on would establish the first Kagyu monastery. Kagyu tradition, in terms of a monastic tradition, wasn't in Tibet. So there was Sakyapa and there was Nimapa. Sakyapa, Nimapa, and then this relatively new Kadampa tradition, which several hundred years later was going to become the Gelugpa tradition that we now have. But it was new. It was six spiritual generations new, more or less 6 or 7 in Tibet. But he went to a monastery and he took monk's vows. He took full monk's vows. And then he took the bodhisattva vow from somebody called Nyukarumpa Tsundru Gyaltsen. And he studied underneath him. Now, I want to comment, it's just Ken's comment. It's just to leave you with questions rather than statements. But what we see in the descriptions of Gampopa are always that before manifesting on earth as this Dr. Gampopa, he was a bodhisattva who'd reached the highest level, 10th level, and who had served, it says, many thousands of Buddhas in the past. Now, when you study the 10 bodhisattva levels, and quite what they are, how many emanations, hundreds, thousands, hundreds of thousands of presences in different worlds one bodhisattva can have, it gives you a kind of huge cosmic idea of the 10th level bodhisattva. Yeah. But then the interesting thing is, when a 10th level bodhisattva, when you actually come into one of these things, a human body, you become a cell, one cell, several cells. Then you grow up with one of these things, with blood and hormones and all the rest of it buzzing around. Then if we look at like the stories from all the 16 Karmapas and so on, although they remember some things, it's not as though like they remember everything. And all the thousands of Buddhas they've served in the past and the 10th level vastness, somehow being in this body limits things. I can't tell you how, I can't say if it's the same for all of them, but it is obviously the case, let's say. The official way of describing it is, of course, they do all of this to show us and teach us Dharma. So Gampopa didn't need to get married, he didn't need to have children, he didn't need to lose a wife and everything. It was to show us something. Yeah, maybe. But it looks very much, when we look at the details of the story, as they're going through their journey for a search for a guru and so on, the hardships they go through, they almost think of sometimes killing themselves because it's so desperate. It seems, so I'm leaving you with just something to think about. The simplified bodhisattva story of a wonderful, pure, vast, free mind, but through the power of love of sentient beings, how that, when that takes birth and manifests, then taking birth and being locked up in a body like we are, brings very many challenges. So anyway, and then of course he was a 10th level bodhisattva, but what he says is that it was after he'd become a monk, and then with Sundru Gyaltsen, he took the bodhisattva vow, and he said, from that moment onwards, throughout my life, I was never one moment without bodhicitta, relative bodhicitta. So when he took the vow, it was obviously a very profound awakening, which is the way it's described in the text, of his previous bodhisattva commitments and activity. But it also means that until that time, if you work the other way by implication, the relative bodhicitta wasn't fully up and running. It's this thing of the cost of taking human incarnation to help others. But anyway, that's just my reflections. Now, this Jalyunda, Sundru Gyaltsen, with whom he took his bodhisattva vow, became his teacher, and for 9 months he studied the Kadampa philosophy with him. And the Kadampa philosophy came from Atisha. What you need to know about Atisha was that he was a great blessing for Tibet, because when he came from India, he was maybe the finest master alive in India, the most learned. And he traveled to Indonesia to go to Selingpa, his teacher, who was the best teacher at the time. He made a terrible, hazardous 13-month journey with shipwrecks and everything in order to go to Selingpa to receive transmissions. He took those back to India. He became one of India's most respected Dharma teachers. But then he was invited to Tibet, and he went. When he got there, he found there was lots of Vajrayana, but that the basis for best Vajrayana practice, which is the Bodhisattva mind, and all the Bodhisattva teachings, and the Vinaya, the monastic commitment to purity and goodness, was really very, very damaged in Tibet. And so he was somebody who restored those, brought them into Tibet, a wonderful gift to Tibet. So it wasn't in conflict with the Vajrayana, but it was providing the moral, ethical, loving heart basis for all of the visualization mantra practices. So Atisha had been 5 or 6 spiritual generations before, and Gampopa studied with his spiritual heirs. He studied very easily. He learned very, very quickly. But where he was studying with Sunju Gyatsen was a busy place, busy monastery. And so he had heard of a geshe called Gyalpo Yundak. Gyalpo Yundak lived more or less in solitude, and he went to him and to study and to get more meditation instructions. He was known as like the top meditator of the Kadampas at the time. So Gampopa went to him. He practiced with him. He developed insight. He achieved in the end the same level of meditation as his teacher. He also, besides studying and mastering meditation, studied the teachings called Lamrim, Stages of the Path, and he did that for about 3 years. So we've got 3 years plus 9 months. Gampopa is with the Kadampa teachers. Now, if we go to Sangyon Heruka's biography, then here he is in a monastery with these very purely behaved monks. I mean, they come from a purist reformer tradition. And he starts dreaming about Milarepa. He dreams of this. Now in the text it says blue. What you need to know is that in the Tibetan language, blue and green get mixed up. You get texts which say, like, in the spring when the grass is blue. And so, however it works, Mumpo in Tibetan sometimes means green. And so he dreamt of this sort of skinny, almost naked person who would sometimes touch him to bless him, sometimes spit on him. And if you read that story, he thinks, is this some kind of negative force trying to get at my very pure meditation? He could sit in shamatha for a week, without moving. Said his hands were one on top of the other, below his navel. It said he would never separate the hands long enough for the sweat to dry. So that the two hands together were a bit warm because he was sitting in meditation, and he would only take micro breaks. Anyway, he thought, is this some demon? So he asked the Sangha and his own teachers, and they did wrathful practice, achala it's called, to get rid of his obstacles. But the more they did those, the more he had powerful dreams of this person touching him and spitting on him, and felt very, very drawn to that person. And then we get in Sangyon Heruka's story how he's walking and he hears 3 beggars talking. One of the beggars, they're all complaining because they're hungry, they're really hungry. And one says, maybe we should make a prayer, strive to find sponsors who can feed us. And the second one says, no, better than that. I mean, if you're going to pray for something, you don't want to pray for sponsors. You want to pray to be the big shot yourself, so that you've got people looking after you under your control. And the third one says, no. If you're going to pray for anything, pray to be like Milarepa, because he doesn't need food anyway in the first place. And he's constantly nourished and best off. And it says as soon as he hears the name Milarepa, he knows he has to go find the yogi Milarepa. Then he asks the beggars, and asks one of them in the end to guide him to Milarepa. If we go to earlier versions of the story, then where he's studying with the Kadampas, there was already one of Milarepa's accomplished disciples who'd been there and who taught meditation. And in fact, the very fact that Gampopa could sit for 7 days in meditation was because of the method, not that he'd learned from his Kadampa teacher, but the method he'd learned from Milarepa's disciple who was visiting. So he'd obviously heard of Milarepa before, and he'd practiced some of the methods, meditation methods, shamatha. that he'd received from his teacher, who was Milarepa's disciple. Either way, he sets out. He knows he has to meet Milarepa. And so let me read you, I'm not quite sure. Sometimes reading takes a lot of time, but stories and anecdotes, they are quite nice. So, and then usually when lamas go through hardships in order to meet their guru, because meeting one's guru and keeping devotion is very important. So anyway, he'd asked one of the older of the beggar, said, "Can you take me to Milarepa?" And the guy said, "Yes." And so they set off in the general direction where they knew Milarepa was. At one point, so I'm reading from the text now, at one point he claimed he wasn't well and he couldn't guide Gampopa any further. In fact, it's because he didn't really know how to go to where Gampopa was at all, and he'd just been doing that to get some money and some food. But when he said, "I'm sorry, I'm not well, I can't go any further, I can't guide you anymore," they were in the middle of an empty plain, no people, no camps, no tents, no animals, total desert. Then the beggar disappeared, he went off. Gampopa found himself alone. He wandered on and on for many days without food, until finally he met a group of merchants. Gampopa asked one of them if he knew where Milarepa could be found, and he said, "Yes, I know Milarepa, I know him well. He's a great meditator, great yogi, but he moves around a lot, from cave to cave, town to town. But I think these days he's in such and such a place." And so he gave Gampopa directions. Gampopa was so relieved, he started hugging the merchant in gratitude. I don't know if you know much about Tibetan men, but he looked like a bit of a nutcase, because he was like, "Oh wow, thank you," and giving him a big hug of gratitude just because he got directions. And then he prayed very, very hard. And so then he went off in that direction for several days. But he'd been so much into his getting to Milarepa, he just hadn't been bothering to eat. And he finally collapsed from exhaustion on the ground. When he woke up, he realized he was out there alone in an isolated place, empty stomach, didn't have the energy to travel on. He thought, "Oh, well, I might simply die here. I probably will die now." Remember, he's a doctor. So he says he started praying that if he was going to die, that in the next life he would be reborn human and meet Milarepa. However, while he was lying on the ground just waiting to die, one of the Kadampa Geshe saw him, and he came over and he said, "What are you doing here?" And Gampopa said, "I'm looking for Milarepa. I've been going for so many days without food, without water. I think I'm going to die. And I'm so sorry. I have no karma to see Milarepa." So the Geshe went, found some food, water, and then he guided Gampopa to the town where Milarepa was staying. Now, what we need to know, I won't read all the story because it takes too much time, but while this was happening, Milarepa was with his disciples, and they say sometimes all of a sudden in the middle of talking to them or teaching, he'd be like suddenly elsewhere. Sometimes he'd shed a tear. Sometimes he was laughing so hard, he put his head underneath his upper robe because he was just doubled up in laughter. And he said, "Don't worry, I'm not losing the plot. I'm not going mad." So they said, "Well, what is it?" He said, "There is someone who will be my major disciple, and I'm following his ups and downs as he travels, and he'll be here soon. And Milarepa makes it clear. Now, this must have been, we don't have time, but when I think of this, I've spent my whole life in Dharma centers. I've seen lots of very famous lamas, the people immediately around them, their best disciples, and then their closer disciples, then the other ones. Milarepa wasn't young. He had some excellent yogi disciples, whole community. And now he tells them, the person who's going to be my main spiritual heir is coming. I think it must have sent somewhat of a ripple through the community, because it, they probably thought, Rechumpa, he's the most accomplished yogi, and this one's good at this, this one's good at that. When a master gets old, they wonder who's going to replace him when he goes. So all of a sudden he announces that, and he said, whoever welcomes him, whoever's the first person to meet this person who's coming, they will have such good fortune. It will be a blessing for many lives. And so anyway, he's been saying these things. And one of his female disciples, who's a villager, lives in a village, and when Gampopa is guided there by this Geshe, she knows this must be him. And so she's the one who gets the good fortune and the good karma, the great blessing for welcoming him. And of course, she knows where Milarepa is. And but she spills the beans, as we say in English. She lets him know, yes, Milarepa told us about you. You're going to be his spiritual heir, and so on. And Gampopa, who's quite something. I mean, there weren't that many monks who could sit for 1 week in meditation, or who were so much on top of the theory of the Bodhisattva teachings and so on. So he just, that's me. Not only am I going to get to meet Milarepa, I'm going to be his main spiritual heir. And so not in a nasty way, because when we say pride and ego, it sounds kind of ugly. But there was something there. So Milarepa heard about this and felt it. He didn't hear about it, he felt it. And so Gampopa talked with the person who'd taken him in, and very happy to look after him in the village. He'd said, can I go up and see him? And Milarepa sent word, no, I won't see him today, I won't see him tomorrow. He made him wait 2 weeks to help him not be so proud. So eventually he gets to see Milarepa, and Milarepa asks him about where he's been, who he is, who he's studied with, and what he does by way of meditation. And Gampopa has brought some offerings. He's brought tea, he's brought some gold and gold dust as offerings, as was the custom. And so anyway, they meet. Milarepa says, he's in a cave. He says, yeah, it's great you brought tea. Just don't have a teapot, don't have a cake, don't have what it takes to make tea here. So Gampopa has to go somewhere where he can, because it's very, very nice tea. He's brought very nice tea. I don't know which tea, but very, very nice tea. So he goes off to brew it as an offering. For the gold dust, Milarepa suddenly becomes very quiet, very, very deep. It's a very special feeling. And he takes a pinch of the dust, throws it in the air to offer to his gurus, and says, I don't need gold, but I offer it to all my gurus. And then in that first meeting, Milarepa pours some chang. Chang is beer, Tibetan beer. It's different strengths. It can be like beer, it can be like wine, it can be like spirit, depending on if it's first brew, second brew, something. Anyway, he pours some chang and gives it to Gampopa and says, drink this. Now, Gampopa's a monk. He has one of his root vows is not to take alcohol. And he said, I can't, I'm a monk. Milarepa says, drink it. And because of so many different reasons, Gampopa thinks this is my guru's instruction. I should drink it. And he drinks it. And it's a very, very good experience. But, and I hope I've got time to explain what I want to explain, this is indicative of something which is so important. So anyway, then Gampopa stays with Milarepa. So he was 31 years old. His journey to get to Milarepa took him 4 months. So it's over that 4-month period that from time to time Milarepa's laughing or crying. It was a long, difficult journey. Once he met Milarepa, he received the whole transmission of the teachings in just 13 months. All the teachings that Milarepa had inherited in an earlier course of mine, we did the path of liberation, path of skillful means, that were combined in Mapa and that were given to Milarepa. All of those teachings of the Tantras and of the Mahamudra instructions, Gampopa, because he was so brilliant, such a perfect receptacle, received them in 13 months. In particular, he received the teachings of Tummo and Tummo practice, which is the Chandali, the inner heat, and that was to be his main practice afterwards. And he received both the Mahamudra transmission line that came from Maitripa to Mapa to Milarepa, and then also the 6 yogas and all of the tantric transmissions of Vajravarahi and Chakrasamvara and so on that came from Naropa to Mapa to Milarepa. All of those he received perfectly, not just received, but at the very end, Milarepa gave him the Guru blessing, which is the Guru puts his feet on the head of the disciple. And this means now you become a holder of this lineage and you are permitted to transmit it to others. And Milarepa said, in one way, I'd like you to stay here until I die and to share so many teachings, but that's not the Dharma, the karma we have. Now you must go and you must fulfill your own destiny. And so, and then he tells him where he needs to go, different places to meditate here, meditate there, and then in the end, go to the place called Dokpo. No, Gampo. Go to the place called Gampo. That's why he's Gampopa. And Milarepa says, you must go. So they prepare for him to leave. He's not kicking him out. He's saying, our time's come to an end. Prepare your journey and go there. And he says, I'll walk with you some of the way up to a certain river, but I won't cross the bridge. After that, you go over the bridge and we'll say goodbye. So then there's one very famous story, is that when they get to the bridge and they say their goodbyes, and it's very, very emotional because it's a huge time they've had together, 13 months, where Milarepa finds somebody who can really hold and transmit everything he's worked so hard for. Gampopa's found his guru and has received everything he could ever wish for. So then they say goodbye. Gampopa goes over the bridge. And then Milarepa shouts after him, wait. He said, I said I've given you everything I have. But there is one more transmission And Gampopa says, oh. Then he comes back over the bridge. He says, do I need to make offerings, offer a mandala requesting the teachings and so on? Milarepa said, no. And then Milarepa simply turns around and lifts up his robe, and he shows Gampopa his buttocks, his bottom, which is such hard leather skin. You know, like people who walk barefoot in some countries all their lives, the sole of the foot is solid, it's hard. And Milarepa said, there's no deeper teaching than this. How I accomplished what I accomplished was through many years of sitting on hard rock, meditating. That's why my bottom's like it is. I take that as a teaching that you must practice. So anyway, then he went, and he went to the places Milarepa had indicated. First, he went to a place called Tsewa Lung. Lung means valley, so the valley of Tsewa. And there he meditated for 6 years, mainly doing the Tummo practice. Tummo, which is about working with your inner channels and chakras. As you purify the inner channels and chakras, it also purifies all the past karma that are associated with the inner, all the past karma, which is somehow linked with blockages in the inner channels. So as we clear the blockages in the channels, we are also getting rid of forever past karma. It's a lot of work. It's why Milarepa had shown his buttocks to Gampopa. You need to do it. There's no way around it. No matter how clever you are, how much Dharma you know, how much blessing there is, for some things you just need to do the work. And this is quite relevant. And so after those 6 years of doing Tummo, he goes for another 3 years to a place called Gewa Valley, Gewa Lung. There, he's mainly practicing Mahamudra, and he achieves a total stabilization of Dharmacharya. He suddenly experiences Milarepa not as an old man, yogi, but as Buddha mind, totally. And he himself becomes enlightened. Now, there's a very, very important thing that happens in these 3 years. Gampopa is someone who's most learned. You couldn't be more learned than he was before he went to Milarepa. He's a monastic of pure conduct, very pure in all his behavior. He's received yogic tantric transmissions from the time he was a teenager, and then from his Kadampa teachers. And from his Kadampa teachers, he's received also Atisha's instructions on Mahamudra. And now he's received from Milarepa all of Milarepa's transmissions. But it's only through all the hard work that he himself becomes a Buddha, and he realizes that even if you're so learned, and even if you're so accomplished in meditation in all sorts, there won't be this becoming of a Buddha, at least in his time and in our time, in one lifetime without devotion. And his devotion to his teacher was immaculate, was pure. And it's through that devotion. So then, because he's then enlightened, he knows, now I need to go to the next place on the list of places that Milarepa gave me, which is the Gampo mountain range. It was a strange thing because Milarepa had told him, when you see me as Dharmacharya, when you experience me as Dharmacharya, then you'll be ready to teach, and you shall go to Gampo mountains, where your activity to teach others will be accomplished. It was strange because the Dakpo mountain range is a rocky, isolated mountain range where there are no people. So he's sending him to a place where there's no people to accomplish his teaching activity. It sounded strange, but of course he trusted Milarepa. And it shows us what my own teacher, Akon Rinpoche, told me. He said, when the time to teach is there, you don't need to go looking for people. People will come to you. So what we see is that Gampopa went to Gampo Mountains. He found places to meditate, caves. And bit by bit, first one, then another one, people came to him. And then once it was known he was there and who he was, more people came. One text says that from then until the end of his life, 53,000 people came to receive his teaching. It shows that when you are ready, people will come to you. You don't need to go putting adverts on Google or anywhere else for disciples. So then, because he was who he was, then monastics came to him. He established the first Kagyu monastery there, and his activity flourished. But through those last 3 years in Gewa Valley, then he knew that the deepest of the deepest teachings, no matter how many people came to him, he could only give to a select few, because they needed to be those whose hearts were capable of deep faith and devotion. But he had all the rest of the Buddha's teachings. So then what we need to know, what do I need to tell you so I don't lose my job, is that he had many disciples, many, I mean hundreds and thousands of people who came to him, but also those who were very close. But he had 4 main disciples, and through them, because they received his transmission quite fully, then what are called the 4, let's call them primary. Often you see them translated as 4 great Kagyu schools, but the 4 primary schools of the Kagyu tradition developed. So they are somebody called Pamotrupa Dorji Jalpo, and he's very important. He was a very learned and a very, very accomplished teacher before he came to Gampopa. We'll come back to him in a moment. So Pamodrupa was one. The first Karmapa, Dusum Jempa, was another one. Through him we have the Karmakaju lineage. Through Pamodrupa we have the Patru Kaju. And then there's Lama Shang. Lama Shang's writings are very, very much quoted, wonderful Mahamudra teachings. And so the Tsalpa Kagyu comes from Lama Shang. And then the Barom Kagyu comes from Barompa, Dhamma Wangchuk. And so those 4 disciples who fully inherited the teachings gave rise to the 4 main or primary Kagyu schools. The first one I mentioned, Pamodrupa, was a very famous, very powerful teacher who had many disciples, and amongst either his direct disciples or their disciples, then we get 8 more Kagyu schools, which sometimes it says 8 minor, but they weren't minor inside. What it meant was that they were a bit later in time. They were secondary. They were the first 4 a bit earlier in time, and then 8 others, or 8 secondary, but all of them through Pamodrupa's disciples, or disciples. So you'll find references to those. It's no point me rattling off a whole load of names and telling you about their traditions. It's online. I've put it online on one of my websites. What I need to do, because this is a long talk, is to round off, to zoom out about the value of Gampopa. What we have in our Kagyu traditions, in our Karma Kagyu tradition, through the Karmapas, are profound yogic transmissions from India that went to India with Mapa, who was a layperson and who had very few disciples, 4 main ones, maybe some others. He lived life as a farmer, quite secretly, and he transmitted what he'd received from India to those main disciples, including Milarepa. He was a layperson with a small community. Milarepa had some simple vows, but he lived, as we know, as a yogi, cotton-clad, in the wild, and he had 2 main disciples, 25 like the sun and the moon, 25 like the stars, it says, but mainly transmitting the yogic practices, the 6 yogas, and of the path of skillful means, and then something of the Mahamudra teachings from Maitripa, from Saraha, originally through Maitripa to Mapa to Milarepa. But relatively small numbers, not monastic. Then from Milarepa, Gampopa receives and masters those teachings. I mean, the heart of it all is Tummo, the Chandali heat yoga, and he masters that, which is central to so much of the other yogic work. It's at the very heart of it all. But he has kept his pure monastic vows, he's kept his bodhisattva vows, he's a master of these things, he can transmit them. So into a very tiny lineage that came from India to Tibet, he brings all his 10th level bodhisattva power to attract tens of thousands of disciples, to establish the first Kagyu monastery, and to make a system of transmission whereby everything's there, the whole Buddhist kit. You can go and become a monastic and practice a very pure moral life. You can take bodhisattva teachings and live as a bodhisattva. You can take the Mahamudra teachings or the tantric teachings of visualization and so on, and practice tantra, practice the yogas. All of it's there, able to be given to people as needed and according to what they're capable of mastering or not. So Gampopa brings a certain strength in terms of numbers. He makes our tradition monastic, so ever after that, the Karmapas have been monastics. If we look at one of the traditions, but there are 4 main or 4 primary schools, one of which is the Karma Kagyu with the Karmapas, and 3 others. And then there's the 8 secondary schools, all of them with their different flavors, emphasis, and so on. They all come from Gampopa and have kept so many teachings alive through time. Some of them have dwindled. None of them disappeared, because when they disappeared as a unique tradition, it's because they were absorbed into another one, integrated. So the strength to make something last through history for 1,000 years comes with Gampopa. And then you'll see sometimes quite scholarly pieces on social media or on the internet about Gampopa, and sometimes people want to pin him down, to say, yes, but when he taught Mahamudra, Did he teach this type of Mahamudra, or was it, people call it co-emergent, Sahaja Mahamudra? Or then what was his own teaching? And what our current Karmapa tells us very clearly is that you can't pin him down like that. He wasn't a proponent of this school or that school. In theory, he looks like he's a proponent of the Indian consequentialist Madhyamaka school, and so on and so on. What he did was to use whichever version of Mahamudra training suited the disciples that he had. And so sometimes people talk about his, excuse me, I haven't got my messages turned off, they're going ding dong. There's something, people call it now Essence Mahamudra, that they say Gampopa taught. Some people say you can't teach Mahamudra without teaching the other three mudra practices. Mahamudra is one of 4 practices with mudra in the name, Samaya Mudra, Kama Mudra, Mahamudra. So they say that it's the sort of top of the pile of those 4. Others say, no, he just taught to some Essence Mahamudra, which is Mahamudra. It doesn't necessarily need the other 3, and so on and so on. You can start going into teachers and lineages and how this line varies from another one here, and so on and so on. It's endless, but what our current Karmapa tells us is that he would teach whatever suited. He had all of them, but the main thing he taught from, like Buddha, was his own mind. I mean, we will call it experience. We don't use that word experience at that level. Realization, we say. But he taught. So for those who were ready to be directly awakened to the Buddha essence of mind, he would simply sit with them and they would awaken. So we call that essence Mahamudra. It doesn't have a name, it just is. The isness of Buddha mind is shared with a disciple who's ready. But that's why he knew he could only do that with few, because in order for that sharing to happen, the disciple needs to have all the right qualities and to be capable of total opening to the blessing. And the guru needs to be totally, purely in that blessing all the time. He needs to be the blessing. Then the two come together as one. Through Gampopa's main disciples, then we have our Kagyu lineages. Many of us here are in the Karma Kagyu lineage. And so Gampopa was the main guru of the first Karmapa, Dusum Chempa. Very much like when Gampopa was with Milarepa, he didn't spend that much time with him because he was already such an amazing mind. He got it all very quickly. It's the same with the Karmapa. When Karmapa was with Gampopa, then he didn't spend that much time, but he received all the transmissions because he was Karmapa. He was this presence of the blessing of all the Buddhas, this 10th Bodhisattva, 10th level Bodhisattva, and so on. He was very, very ready. I don't know if there's, there's one more thing to say, which takes us back to the beginning, my own connection, and so on, is that Gampopa wasn't planning any reincarnations. We know that his disciple, Karmapa, of course, was going to reincarnate, be the first Tulku in Tibet, and so on and so on. But Gampopa didn't plan to reappear. He zoomed in from the highest level, did wonders for our Kagyu lineage, set it beautifully on its feet, and then work done, job done. But he said, in the future, if people want to experience me, then if with devotion, which was in a way his deepest teaching, like we see in our prayers, devotion is the very heart of our Mahamudra practice. If somebody with devotion, I don't want to use the word studies, but I can't think of another word, studies my texts with an open heart, they read my words, my teachings, then I will be there. And he said this to one of his disciples, just like I'm here now with you, in the future I will be with people. So with his writings, we have mainly two main works. We have now all the collected works of Gampopa, but the most famous one, and the version you can get, that's been a big part of my life, is of course this Ornament of Precious Liberation. This contains all the what they call the Lamrim, or stages of the path teachings from his Kadampa gurus. And then the other main part of his writing is called the Supreme, a Jewel Rosary of the Supreme Path. And that's his teachings gathered from everywhere. It's a compendium. It's an unusual mixture. Sometimes it's very deep. It's stuff from Tantra for retreaters. It's a yogi's instructions. Sometimes it's very basic Dharma. And it comes as the 10 this, the 13 that. It's very, very, very precious advice. So if we study either of those with an open heart, then Gampopa's presence will be with us. It's my prayer that Gampopa's presence will be with you through those texts, through those studies. There is a very condensed teaching called the Four Dharmas of Gampopa. It's in fact just 4 lines of text, but which through the lineage transmission we can unpack into one of the very famous Kadampa teachings about the 3 types of precious human being and the stages of the path for all of them. That too is said to contain Gampopa's blessing. So I think that's it for today. It's been a longish talk. I'm just sharing something so that you make a bit of a deeper connection with Gampopa on this very, very special, auspicious day. Let's dedicate anything that was good. Sonam diye tamche sikpani, tobne ne petranam bamche ne, je gana chiparak trukpaye, sipe sole, drowa drowarisho, janchub semcho rinpoche, ma jepano jechiochik, jepan yampa me padang, kongne, kongdo, warisho.